Hi everyone and welcome to the Idle Guitars YouTube channel. Today I'm going to show you how I installed a Graphtec nut on this guitar and how you can install a Graphtec Tusk nut or bone nut on your own instrument. The first step to replacing a nut is removing the old nut. For this I use a set of end nips. You can just use these to grab the nut and rock it back and forth a little bit. So you can pull it out. The next step is to take your replacement nut and make sure it fits in the nut slot. So we're going to make sure the width is correct. And because this is a Graphtec nut, it comes already set to the correct width. So it should fit snugly, but not too tight that you can't remove it. So I can still, well, it's a little tight. Still pull this out with my fingers. It looks like this nut slot here isn't very smooth, so instead of trying to shave down some of the nut material, we're going to file out that nut slot a little bit. I just have this square tooth file. I'm going to run it along the edges of the nut slot until they're nice and smooth, nice and even. We'll check it again, see if it fits in there better. And that's much better. Now that the nut fits into the nut slot, we need to make sure that the length of the nut matches the width of the fingerboard. And you can see right now, it sticks off a little bit on both sides. So what we're gonna do is take a pencil and mark the nut right at the edge of the fingerboard on both sides. And I do this on both sides to make sure that everything gets ground up nice and evenly, instead of having one side remaining factory flat and the other side being ground and rounded. So we have both of our marks. We're going to take this over to the disc sander. That got the width much closer, but you can still feel the edges of the nut when you rub your fingers over it. So I'm going to hand sand this just to make it perfectly smooth. Okay, this is 600 grit sandpaper set up on a flat surface in my lap. And what I'm going to do is just take the nut and sand down the edges a little bit. You won't be able to feel them poking out the sides of the neck. Now I'll check it, and if it feels comfortable, I'll move on. The next step would normally be bringing the height of the nut down to a manageable working size. But this is another step that using a pre-fit Graphtec nut is going to save for us. But how I would normally do this is I would take my feeler gauges and I would grab just this bottom set up to the brass one. And I would bend them over the neck, over the edge of the fingerboard, and then make a line right at the top, and then I would grind the nut blank down to that line so that it would just save me a few fractions of an inch filing out the nut slots. But like I said, this one's already about a good size. So the next step will be making marks for our string spacing. I have my notches penciled in, and so now it's time to take my nut slotting files and just make a teeny tiny divot on those lines, just deep enough for a string to rest so that I can check the spacing with my calipers. Alright, you can see there's just a tiny little dent there, and I'm going to do that for the other 6 strings as well, or the other 5 strings, excuse me. The nut slots have all been given a shallow cut, so I'm going to use my calipers here to measure the distance between the strings. Now I say measure, but really I'm just going to compare them. You don't need to read any of the markings here on the side, or if you have a digital caliper or whatever, you don't actually need to read it. Just get your ends in there. Now that's the width between those 2 strings. And these ones are about the same, so that's good. This one's a little tight, so something might have to move. This one's really tight. And that one is just a tiny bit loose. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this string this way a little bit. Probably do the same with this one. Just a tiny bit so that everything feels the same when you're playing it. To do that, starting with this B string, I'm going to take a file that's the appropriate size. In this case, it's 13 gauge. Loosen that string so that I can take it out of the nut slot. And because I just have to move it a little bit, what I can do is use my file to just kind of use it sideways like this and just kind of push that slot sideways there. It's hard to do this while I'm holding the camera, but you just work it to widen it out a little bit, and then once you get a new edge that's closer to that E string, you can start cutting downward again. The string spacing is set now, so it's time to deepen all of the slots to the desired depth. What I do is I cut them so that they are 18 thousandths of an inch off the first fret right here. This sixth string is done, and here's how I check. I have my feeler gauge sitting on top of the first fret. I'm going to pluck the string, and you'll hear that the string doesn't buzz out off the feeler gauge, but it does rattle a little bit. And I apologize for doing this with one hand. Hear it buzzing? It doesn't change the note, and it doesn't kill the string, but it does cause a little bit of buzz. Here's the nut now that it's been slotted. The only thing left to do is final shaping, polishing, and installation. So we're going to go back over to the disc sander, and I'm going to grind off the top of this in such a way that when the strings are back in it, each string will just barely poke out above the top of the nut. You don't want the strings to be buried in the nut, you want them to stick out just a little bit. Here's the nut sanded to 2000 grit and then buffed. It makes it look really nice and shiny, and it also makes it feel really smooth, so it'll be comfortable in your hand while you're playing, and there'll be nothing there, no sharp snags or anything to catch on the strings and ruin your tuning stability. This is normally the point when I would lubricate this nut if it was a bone nut, but because it's a tusk nut, it's actually self-lubricating and it doesn't need anything added to it to make it slippery. So all that's left to do is put a little dab of glue on it so that it'll stay in the nut slot, and then install it. On the underside of this nut, it has these two holes that help it to kind of grab the glue, let the glue get some purchase in there. So I'm just going to put a little tiny dab of glue, really small, in each of those holes. Because the strings are really going to do a good job of holding this on, but that glue is there to make sure that nothing can shift around and that the nut won't come off if the strings are removed. The nut is installed, and the only thing we need to do to clamp it down is tune the guitar up to pitch, and the strings will hold it in place. So that's how you do it. That's how you install a tusk or bone nut on your electric guitar. Hope you learned something today that you can use when working on your own instruments. And if you feel still a little unsure about doing this yourself, you can always bring your guitar to me, and I'd be happy to work on it for you. You can find me online at idleguitars.com or on Facebook and Instagram under the Idle Guitars name. If you liked what you saw in this video and you would like to hear this guitar in action, maybe go check out the full build and demo video I did of this guitar. I'll link that on the end screen. And please like, subscribe, and comment on this video. I appreciate it.